webinar on printing specifically for macro photography. I'm the host of this session here, Don Komarechka, and we're going to tackle some of the challenges that are commonplace in macro photography as it pertains to printing. Some of the challenges that we face are really particular to sort of constructed imagery. So in the sense of some of my water droplet refraction work, we're dealing with colors that are generally outside the gamut of a lot of different printers. And we'll come back to this kind of concept a little bit later on in the webinar. But color, it not necessarily has to be 100% accurate to the subject matter, but it does have to be predictable in the printing process. And so there are ways that we can deal with calibration and with soft proofing our imagery in order to make sure that we get results that we expect out of the camera, and that follows through all the way to the printing process. And when I'm dealing with the extremes of anything from my snowflake work, we have extreme brights and we have extreme darks. Where the images have a very dark background around them and oftentimes very white areas that are almost blown out but just riding that edge of as bright as it can possibly be. And how do you maintain that in a print, and what material is going to work on creating a print of this nature as best as it can be? We'll also talk about everything from optical brightening agents and papers, what papers I prefer, how I calibrate my imagery, and of course many questions that might come up along the way. So I think this will be a pretty fun webinar for us to dive into. We'll cover sharpening and stuff as well, because images like this snowflake, they're cropped in considerably from the original source material. And while we don't cover a whole lot of the editing process on webinars like this, I do want to touch on how to make sure that you get as much detail as possible in the final print. So if I start with an image, something like this wonderful bee photograph, which to me, this was a happy image to make. This image, it's very specifically organized. I placed the daisy-like flower in the background that's giving you the yellows and the magentas in front of a blue flower that had a very nice vibrant blue color. And this bee was only cooperative because I sprayed him with water and he couldn't fly away. And so then you take him and you move him to the spot where he needs to be and to orchestrate this shot. And it's a fun image to throw into this webinar because this is a difficult image to print for a number of reasons. You've got colors that are at the extremes in saturation. And a lot of my macro work generally plays into this high saturation and create something that is, vibrant and crazy and beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily result in a print that echoes that. So you've got to make sure that all of these colors come through. Part of the thing that I do whenever I'm making a print is I calibrate. And in a general sense, I use the X-Rite Color Monkey photo, which I've used for many years, and it has done wonders for my prints. But for images like this specifically, I always take it through an extra calibration cycle, where with the Color Monkey photo, you have the ability to enhance a calibration with an additional color chart based on an image that you might be feeding into it. So if I were to be feeding in this image, for example, it would create another scannable chart that would have the magentas, the yellows, the blues that are in this image specifically, that then adds to the calibration of my printer with that specific piece of paper, and that to me works really, really nicely. The challenge, however, is in this case, I don't want to be printing off a whole bunch of special calibration charts when I know that if I add a little bit of extra information from the three primary colors that are in this image, I'll end up with something useful. So sometimes what I do is I take just a mishmash of images, in this case bits and pieces of samples of different images that I know have very vibrant colors, like the vibrant magentas, reds, and yellows, and oranges. And I just make like an overlaying collage image that visually is quite distracting and disruptive. But this is just the image that gets fed in to the Color Monkey software. And it will generate a test chart that has some of the colors from all of these images all in that one patch, and that's a very useful thing for me to go through and just take that information and add that to the calibration so that my colors for those extremes become a little bit more accurate. Especially for images let's take a look at one of my most famous photographs to date, an early one of mine, but a very popular one. This image of red maple leaves placed on a bed of snow. I was very particular about the color of red that these leaves ended up being. They had to mimic the Canadian flag. But I also wanted the snow to have as much detail as possible, but also be placed on a white background. And so I didn't want the snow to be gray. I know that many times in the past I had worked at a retail camera shop, a print shop, and we had used some pretty high-end printing equipment, the Fuji Frontier systems, which, as a slight tangent, were wonderful. If you could ever find somebody that still prints on those, they were fun because they would use lasers to expose photosensitive paper that would then pass through a traditional chemical bath. And they had a really interesting feel to the prints that you could get. But that shop has since closed down, and I believe most of them have at this point, unfortunately. Anyhow, tangent aside, looking at an image like this, I want those whites to be as bright as possible. And in that camera shop, we got so many people that were bringing in photographs that they had taken on the ski hills or in the wintertime, and the camera just darkened things down too much because of all of the bright content in the imagery. And so we would manually go in and correct their images to be brighter based on a known white point. And so when I'm editing my image, and this is true of the soft proofing process, but even when I'm just putting an image together, I'll often switch the background around the image to be white. And this is a valuable technique from a visual standpoint. Even if you've got a calibrated setup, the brightness of your monitor and your lighting conditions that you might be in can sway things in a way that you might think that it's bright and perfectly balanced to the right brightness and levels that you need, but the density of the image might be a bit too heavy if it goes through the printer that way, because transmitted light is a heck of a lot different than reflected light, and that's the difference between seeing it on a screen and seeing it on print. Surrounding the image with a white border, which is easily done in Lightroom or Photoshop, is just a simple way to figure out what it's going to look like if it's printed on white paper and how the other colors and everything kind of jumble around that. So it's a simple trick. It's one that uses just the visual perception based on a known maximum value for white to see exactly where the whites happen to lie in your photograph. And so that's how I ended up sort of visually calibrating as a first step an image like this. And so in that case, I've got the whites just below their peak values in a lot of areas. I've got some shadows that are coming in that are balancing out the image quite nicely. And while this is a little bit larger than a macro scale image, a lot of those same rules apply to most of my macro work. If I were to take a look at the other end of the the magnification spectrum, the snowflakes themselves, they are wonderful, beautiful subjects, but these are hard to print. Number one, I like to have the background behind my snowflake just above black when it's on a transmitted light medium. So that is your computer screen, your cell phone, whatever it happens to be. Not completely solid black so that it's just like it's completely cut out from the background, just enough maybe on the edges or where there's some little interactions that give it a slightly different feel. But if I were to print it this way, it's not going to look good. The black is going to end up being solid black in almost every case because it is so close to it. Those blacks just end up getting all muddy. And so what I'll try to do is I'll boost up those blacks, both in the background and sometimes in the contours within the snowflake itself, in order to give just a little bit of extra room to play with ink levels on those darker tones. And so in this case, if I were to take this, and this is an interesting play on color depth in an image, if I were to take the already edited image and try to brighten it up, well, it works, but it doesn't really work in the way that I wanted it to, because the edited image that I had saved initially was an 8-bit JPEG. So when I'm trying to push up shadows of an image, I'm always saving my final results as a TIFF file that's 16-bit, so that I have the latitude to push and pull those shadows and create a certain variance there where there might not have been in the smaller 8-bit JPEG file. If I were to zoom in on the upper corner of this image, you'll see what I mean. You've got these jaggy lines that are running across the image, and I've seen this actually when I had taken some of my landscape work that had a very subtle shift in blue across the sky. It was an HDR, it was almost a perfect tone, but it had a subtle shift. And I ended up getting some jaggy lines in the print because the printer, this is before I was printing my own work, the printer was converting the higher end file that I was sending them to a JPEG before printing it. and to me that's a no-no. It's also when I'm prepping a file for printing, having the master TIFF file at a 16-bit depth is always going to be a better solution for you. And so if I were to take that version of it and boost it up, you won't see those jaggy lines anywhere. You'll see that subtle cloud of black comes into the print. Now the actual print is going to push that down further than what you see it. If I had edited this properly, I would clean up the background a little bit more than it currently is. But that's one of the processes that I would go in for printing. Is I always make sure that my blacks, especially if they're in a large blob, don't get too black. And for my snowflakes, that is always part of the process. As a comparison directly, this was the original one that was put into the internet and social media and everywhere else online at large. But the version of it that I print is always going to be slightly modified in that regard. So again, the print version of it will have a lightened background because I know that that's going to be pushed a little bit further into black, but there will be some subtle variations that I'll still be able to see in the print when I'm dealing with that as a finished product, especially under the right lighting and with the right kind of paper, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit here. But yeah, so any of those images that I produce, they'll always go through a slightly different process when I end up printing them. And I don't print all of them, so it's not a process that I do at the very beginning. But I have to be aware of what happens with those black backgrounds. And the whites as well, because in this image, I've got a lot of areas that are just barely kissing pure white and riding that edge in order to give me the best contrast within the snowflake itself. And when I'm printing, having a well-calibrated setup where I'm not just overexposing the image in order to make the blacks appropriately brighter, that's going to push a lot of this stuff just completely overexposed, and it's not going to be a very useful image to me. In Photoshop or Lightroom, I'll use Camera Raw, the Camera Raw filter, or the Lightroom sliders in order to just boost those blacks up independently of the other brightness areas of the image, and that makes a big difference for me. When I was putting all of these images together into a larger project that I call the Snowflake, simply enough. It was 2,500 hours of work across 5 years to composite all of these snowflakes into a single poster print. And the biggest I printed this is 44 by 66 inches in size. And the full resolution of this file is just gargantuan. But in this case, I needed to make sure that even though I had nice high contrast edges around the print, that the white points did not completely overexpose in any way. The blacks in this case I actually kept as black because they're somewhat inconsequential. They're just the gaps in between the snowflakes. But you have to kind of pick and choose your battles here. It wouldn't be useful to lower the contrast in the image when you had so much going on, especially when this is printed at its smaller size. The smallest I've done it is a 16 by 24, I believe. So when you're dealing with this kind of high contrast printing, it's always a good idea to boost up the blacks a little bit. And I encourage some testing, because no matter how well the printer is going to be calibrated, there's still sort of a visual perception, especially based on the kind of paper, if it's a glossy or a matte or a metallic paper, how those blacks are going to show themselves in the finished product. What I've done in the past is I've printed small samples of maybe just a portion of an image, processed with different brightnesses on the background, or the whole image just printed very, very small, and then you do a little test sample to get a feel for how that's going to work. And every image that you do similar in that way is going to kind of follow the same mentality as you move forward through it. So that was a big project to work on. And I've printed macro work in books as well, so here's another quick little tangent, because I did this book project, and man, this drove me nuts in terms of color calibration and print quality. And it's something that I guess photographers won't normally see, but I want to pull back the curtains here a little bit to show you what dastardly frustrations I had when I was dealing with printing this book. The first press run of this book was done on a web press. And it was a fairly antiquated press from, I think, the 1970s that was updated with more computer-controlled components and what have you. But when they were calibrating this book, when it was going to print, they were doing it like just eyeballing it. And when you're eyeballing that, you might not be doing it frequently enough, and you certainly might not be doing it accurately enough compared to what an automated system can do. And so when I got the entire first print run of this book, let's leave the wavy, rippled, looking like water-damaged pages out of the equation, which was part of the printing process, having all of the heavy black content on the pages. But if you look at some of the pages in terms of color accuracy, or at least color consistency, my God, they were off. Because the person behind the press was thinking, oh yeah, that looks like a nice blue snowflake. Well, no, it's not supposed to be that blue. And you know, one is slightly purple. Somewhat might be perfect, and then the one in the middle there is almost like a brown tone. I was very, very disappointed with that process of eyeballing calibration. And so when I put up a huge fuss, they ended up redoing the entire print run of the book. And the second time that they had done that, I was so thankful that it wasn't on the same equipment. Not only for the slight ripple pages that you're seeing in this case, which were more pronounced on some of the other books, but for color accuracy and quality of the overall print. So the second time around, it was done on a sheet-fed press. And this Heidelberg machine would spit it out in sheets, wait for that to dry, and then pass it through again on the other side and print the other side. But they were checking everything. They were checking the registers. Everything was automated with all sorts of really fun charts to go over, and I couldn't understand all of it that they were looking at, but they were constantly dynamically checking the entire print run for that. And by the way, the automated scanner that would scan all of these color charts at the top of this page, that was an X-Rite product. That was the X-Rite IntelliTracks, which again is not a consumer product, but the X-Rite logo is on that for sure. And I am so very thankful that it was calibrated, because I stayed on press the entire time for the entire print run. And that was 36 hours straight, signing off on everything that came off of that second print run to make sure that the prints, all of those snowflakes and all of the content, all of the pages were as accurate as they could be. That was the most exhausting smile that I'd ever had in my life at that point. So color accuracy is important. You don't know what you're missing until it's gone, and you realize how poorly it can be done in certain scenarios, and how you can get that color accuracy as good as it can possibly be is always something that I strive for, whether I'm making a single print or I'm putting a book together. And so, you know, when you're dealing with these particular imagery, you have to consider what the type of material is that you're going to be printing on. In that case, it was a really nice, high-quality paper for the book. My photographic prints often take on a variety of different materials based on the brightness and the contrast in the imagery. So, for example, the snowflakes, as we're seeing them here, they've got a lot of high white content. So the actual paper surface is going to be revealed where the print is white. And so it's a very important distinction that we make there for a number of reasons. One of them is, if I need to have a certain shimmer or shine to a print, I'm going to have that white area as bright as possible. But if I'm using a paper like just a standard luster paper that is a bright white paper, if there's white on the print, like a pure white, then it's going to have a certain gloss differential compared to the heavier black. If you look at the print from an angle, you would see this differential. And some printers will have a gloss coating that they put on top of it. The new Canon Pro 2000 and 4000 printers that I may upgrade to at some point in the future will have a little gloss cartridge. I know Epson has had it for a long time on some of their printers. You remove that issue, it's not a problem when you're dealing with it. But in certain images, when I'm dealing with this wonderful bee flying into a series of crocuses, it's got a lot of white content on it, and it's got a certain shimmer to it just in the image itself. And so that will lend itself very well to some of the papers that I use. And I choose the paper that I print on specifically based on what it's going to do to the photograph. In this case, because it is a high white content image, this is probably one that I would print on my favorite metallic style paper, which is from Ink Press. They make their metallic satin paper. And so there's three main papers that I typically print on when I'm dealing with macro work. High white content that is the subject or enhances the imagery will be on that metallic satin. I dislike a heavy, like a gloss metallic paper, because it takes too much of itself in the final presentation. In some images, in some cases, that can work nicely, but I like the subtle approach. I want the paper to enhance the image and not be an overt shift and say, oh wow, that's a nice metallic print. I want people to say that's a nice print and not really build it onto the medium more than the imagery itself. So the Inkpress Metallic Satin is a subtle metallic, and I like that a lot. For some of my ever so slightly warmer tone images, I love the Photo Rag Burita from this. I've got it from Hahnemühle. A lot of other companies make this. Ilford makes a great burrito style paper as well. This has an extremely beautiful quality to the colors, the pop that it produces for the imagery. It's not as bright white and it's not as shimmery, but for a warmer tone image that doesn't have those bright whites, it is an excellent choice for paper. I use Breathing Color for my standard luster paper. They have their Vibrance luster that I really quite like. It's got a high white point, but it doesn't have that much in terms of optical brightening agents and things like that, which I would like to share as I kind of mention these papers, a brief description about what optical brightening agents are. And I'll do a quick little live demo here. And so I'll share my webcam. And so I've got my webcam going, and I'll pause my screen. In this little brief piece of the demo, I'm going to show you with a flashlight that I have that is an ultraviolet flashlight. So it emits, I mean, the webcam has a poor ultraviolet filter, so it will see some of it. But I've got a piece of the canvas that I typically print on, and there's a canvas print behind me that's done on the Breathing Color Live canvas. This canvas has a very good quality in terms of optical brightening agents. If I shine this light on it, you can see that it is fairly dim. There's a little bit of color coming off of it. And so if I compare that to a standard piece of white paper and I shine that on, you can see that there is a huge difference in the amount of optical brighteners that are in this particular kind of paper. And there's a reason why you want to have low optical brighteners. Number one, if I had this paper outside in bright sunlight, it's going to change its color because it's going to have a lot of ultraviolet light hitting it from the sun that reflects back in the visible spectrum, called fluorescence, and your colors will shift slightly in that process. They won't shift if the paper itself has very little or no optical brightening agents in them. The longevity of that paper is also going to be in question if there's a lot of OBAs. Traditionally, they're great for the short term, but they'll yellow over time or they'll become unpredictable over time and they're not archival. So if you're curious about which papers have optical brightening agents, a lot of the literature for the higher end papers will specifically state whether or not they don't. If they say that they don't, you can pretty much guarantee it, although you're welcome to test yourself. If they don't mention if they do or not, then be suspect to see what that's going to be. So that's just a brief little demo of what optical brightening agents are and how you can test for them. By the way, the light that I'm using for this is it's a Nightcore Chameleon CU6, which has an optical an ultraviolet light in it as well as a white light. But you can buy cheap lights for like 15 bucks off of eBay or Amazon that are designed to find dog pee on carpets. They can function to detect OBAs in papers just as well. So I'll stop sharing the webcam and we'll go back to what I was talking about with papers here to get a feel for what I like to print on as far as the kind of medium. I found that most metallic papers, to some degree, they do have OBAs in them. Maybe it's just the nature of how you get the metallic surface to it, but the metallic satin tends to perform better than most. A print like this, I'm not even sure what the name of the flower is, just sitting in water with a mottled kind of circular background created with the optics of a Trioplan 100 lens that it's known for its soap bubble bokeh, creates a really interesting kind of earthy toned image. I would print this for sure on the Burita paper more than I would anything else. It does have some white points in it. You know, the little, I guess the stamens are down by the center, so this would be the pistils coming out in the center of the flower if I get my anatomy right. They're bright white, but I'm not sure if that would warrant the overall feel of the image being put onto a metallic type paper overall. An image like this, purely warm tones, definitely a Burita style paper, which is more expensive. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I charge people a lot if I'm printing on the more expensive material. This would also look decent on just a Vibrance luster kind of paper as well. You don't necessarily have to have all the best and most brilliant. An image that has these warm tones could be printed truly on any of those kinds of papers. It's more abstract in its nature, would look good on any of them at its very core. But in an image like that bee that we showed you earlier, this one would perform best, I think, on that vibrance luster. It's going to have something that really just kind of covers the entire gamut, doesn't need to be sparkly, it is bright and saturated enough. So that's just a general sense, an idea of what we're going to for that in terms of the kinds of paper that we're dealing with. But I've got a few other interesting bits and pieces to discuss here. One of them has to do with how we deal with color and how we make sure that color presents itself as accurately as possible. In this sense, I've got this wonderful freezing soap bubble image that has it's made with ultraviolet light that is fluorescing and making the bubble glow into this beautiful blue tone. This was the most difficult image that I've ever had to print. So I want to talk about how I can make sure that the colors come out at the very end. And in this case, we've got another image that has some very, very bright and saturated colors. The magentas particular in these kinds of imagery are a real pain to deal with. So I'm going to switch over to Lightroom for a brief moment here and talk about soft proofing and how we can figure out how to push these colors into a more appropriate place to get a better rendition of the image overall. So in this sense, if I'm in the develop module, of course, that's where the soft proofing is. If I click on that little soft proofing checkbox, a few things will happen here. Number one, the background will turn white, like I had mentioned, is a very useful thing to judge the brightness of the print overall, and it imitates the brightness of the paper as best as it can. I've calibrated my printer, so I've got a number of different profiles within here, and I can choose what I might want to be printing this particular thing on. And I've got this checkbox that says simulate paper and ink. And so if I click that off, it doesn't imitate the paper. If I click it on, it does dull things down a small bit on this particular paper, but on other papers, like, for example, my fine art matte, it really flattens the image out to give you an idea as to how it's going to present itself on that particular paper. I don't use the fine art matte very often. In some cases, it can be useful. But if I'm talking about in terms of color, I need to know what the printer rather can produce in terms of color. And what you'll find is if you've got a lot of magenta tones in an image, a printer will uniformly have a hard time dealing with those brighter magentas. If I click on in this top corner, it says destination gamut warning, destination being the printer. And what you're seeing here, all of the red around the frame, it's warning me that these colors are going to be outside of the gamut of the printer. Now, in some cases, I want to be fairly accurate about it, because if these yellows, for example, switch to be too green, then that can be problematic for me. I want to make sure that I can at least predict that. Sometimes when it comes in terms of these magentas, I don't necessarily need perfect color accuracy, especially if they're at the edges of the frame, if they're in the background. So while there might still be warnings at the end of my adjustment, I'm not necessarily going to beat myself up over it. But if I come down and I'm playing around with the HSL, and if I take this yellow slider, the hue, saturation, and luminance, and under hue, if I can move this yellow slider around, you'll notice that as I move it further towards orange, it becomes incredibly red. If I move it further towards green on the other side, it becomes something that is completely printable and predictable. If I go further towards green, the image will then go out of gamut again in this particular kind of paper. So I have to choose the exact color of yellow that I would prefer to have that has a proper representation of it. So that's how you can use the soft proofing to figure out exactly where your colors are going to come in. And I can do the same with the magenta. You'll find that it has a fairly hard time getting accurate results unless I'm manipulating to a great degree both the hue, the saturation, and the luminance in order to shift it into an area that is more printable. And I might not even get it all the way complete, but at least it's in better shape now than it was to begin with. If I do something similar to that with this freezing bubble image that I love so much, and it took me so long to get this right, it ended up being that soft proofing was the solution to just play it by the numbers and make sure that I get it as close to natural as possible. If I turn on that warning here, the entire center of this bubble falls out of gamut. And to me, if I were to zoom in on that and turn this warning off, you'll see that there might be some subtle shifts from brightness and darkness and saturation. If I can't predict how that's going to be remapped, then it's going to give me awful results. And I should actually scan one of the prints that I had from this because it was just laughably bad out of camera. Even though I had a calibrated printer and everything, these colors are really hard to reproduce the way that you might be seeing them. So the print that I ended up producing, if I turn this gamut warning back on, the print that I ended up producing was this one here. I ended up brightening up quite a bit of the image overall. And yes, there's still a few little red specks here and there, but it printed fantastic as a result of that shift. And so yeah, it is it's almost a transformed image from what it was unpredictably in this place where it was relatively dark in the center to being something that I actually found worked really well as a print. Specifically pushing the colors to a closer to white level made it an exceptional metallic satin print, and I was very happy with the results as they came through with that particular image. And you know, if we were to go to another image somewhere in this series, let's go for this guy right here. This one, again, another favorite image of mine, but these magentas are just torturous on a printer. If I turn that soft proofing on, you'll see that you've got all of those warnings up in those brighter, most saturated magenta areas, and they're also coming through in all of the refracted droplets here along the way as well. There might be something that I can do to make sure that it's more consistent, to make it maybe match some of the other colors, but just be prepared that if you're dealing with extremely saturated, bright, almost neon colors, that you're probably going to have a hard time making sure that they're as accurate as possible. I've got these greens in the center here that if I'm looking at them, they're almost a little bit more towards turquoise ever so slightly. So if I maybe, if I'm controlling maybe the aquas or the greens, it's always a hard time to figure out exactly where they're going to fall. I can manipulate and change the accuracy of those particular colors in some way. Sometimes it's just non-cooperative and I have to use the little tool on the side, which is a great adjustment tool when I don't know what color it is actually going to correspond to in terms of these sliders. I can click on that little tool, move it up or down over top of these areas, and I can see, well, I can control that. It's not going to adjust the color very well there. I can control that in saturation, and I can see, well, if I desaturate it, well, I clearly can print that, but now it looks like a lifeless twig. So you choose exactly where it's going to come in as far as the liveliness of the image, where your color accuracy and your hues are going to be properly presented as well. Again, you don't have to be critically accurate for a lot of these images, so long as it's predictable in the outcome as your final product. There was one image that I wanted to include in this one little preview as well, and this is again that maple leaf flag photograph. That those reds, they've got to be as accurate as I can make them. And so in this particular image, when I have my soft proofing on with the hide or the reveal the gamut warnings, it's going to show me no, of course, the red leaves, but it's not going to show me any of those warnings over top of it. If I were to choose a different paper, however, maybe my fine art matte paper, my fine art matte paper will not be able to reproduce the same colors as my Vibrance Luster paper would. And so I can choose, maybe I'd be using the Hanamuyo Photo Rag for this, and it produces them also very, very well. The metallic satin would also have them completely in gamut. So it all depends on the kind of paper that you use, in addition to the printer, what kind of colors you're going to be able to reproduce. Matte papers typically do worse at color reproduction than glossy papers, but the kind of paper that you have at your disposal, I don't want to say spend more on paper, but evaluate what the options are and maybe get some sample packs and see how they perform in calibration tests, and then you'll get a feel for what's going to be your daily driver for what to print on in a regular basis. So that's an interesting little aside to the imagery that I'm trying to produce. They look great on a screen, but if I'm trying to make that on a print, you have to be aware of the limitations sometimes in those really bright and saturated colors. Here's another example where in this case, I've got some bright white points where I've got the gazania in the background coming into some prominence, but that's not the main focus of the image. So while that would shimmer on a metallic print, that's not necessarily what I'm going to put on a metallic print, because it's going to be a distraction in the background rather than something that would be more cohesive on a luster type paper. And then that brings me into a fun little twist on this, because all of these images I would most certainly print, but with macro work, I have to say, in some cases you'll ride the line in an image that is a wonderful thing to look at on a computer screen, but it might not be something appropriate to print and frame on the wall. And I've done some work where this cicada that's shot in ultraviolet light, it's glowing and it's brilliant, and it might make a good print, but it's definitely close to the line. For me, it might be on the side of no print because it's a bit too unusual or chaotic. In the case of this grasshopper, this I think is on the appropriate side of the line, where it has a nice fresh green feel to it. And while it is an insect, it does have a nicety to it that I think wouldn't be disruptive if it's printed really large on somebody's wall. I do a lot of insect work. I'd say that this guy rides a little bit further away from the line, this chironomid. It is interesting. I might want it on my wall, but I'm not going to print something like this and have it at an art show, because it's probably not going to sell. And the same thing is true of even more gruesome insects. If you're afraid of spiders, just don't look at the next image. I always give that warning out. This is one of my favorite jumping spider photographs, and it's got this wonderful action and narrative to it, but I would never print this photograph. So just know your limit within your subject matter to figure out what you might be printing and what you might not be. My experiments in terms of whatever the heck this is invisible ink and ferrofluid mixed together in some weird concoction that was a wonderful narrative that I was building for a presentation. Again, a fantastic image, but not one I think that would be a worthy print subject. A challenging one, mind you, if I wanted to get it accurate with those brights and darks and extreme colors. Even if I could cover all of those challenges, it's just not an interesting enough subject on the macro scale to print. But the same ingredients there that fluoresce, I can put highlighter ink in the center of a Grabera daisy, and it ends up looking like a little pool of lava in the center of this image. Again, with those saturated colors, those bright whites, those dark areas, these images, there are challenges in printing this accurately. The brightest areas are not completely bright white. They have an ever so slight yellow tone to them that was difficult to maintain in that area in order to make sure that it would come through properly in print. And there was extra care in those highlights and those shadows to make sure that it was all right in the proper balance to be printed appropriately. If I was looking at one of my favorite macro images of all time, by the way, this one is all in Gamut. There's nothing that would be an issue to print. It's actually the print that I have sitting behind me right now. The biggest I've printed this is 30 by 40, although I'm sure I could handle it larger. Whenever I'm doing larger imagery, I always print it on canvas. It ends up being more cost effective, and the quality is just fantastic, and I can stretch it here myself in my studio. I don't have to worry about getting it framed and paying the expense to somebody else. But in this kind of an image, when I've got a big canvas print of it, I'm going to put a big price tag on it as well. And in order to make sure that I can sell that, there's a little trick that I have that I do for almost all of my macro imagery. It's not a printing trick, but it is a sales trick when you're trying to sell a print. And it's to take a photograph of that image behind the scenes. And so the behind the scenes imagery that I have of these macro images, this is a wildflower seed, specifically prairie smoke, placed on a little clamp that's held just below the surface of water in a bucket with an African daisy, some species of osteospermum in the background, that is creating that image overall. And so when I have this and I have it on display, I show people a small print of the behind the scenes image, and I say that I'll give you the small print. You can tuck it behind the frame of the canvas, or frame it yourself if you so choose, as a conversation piece for them about how the image was made and produced. And that one little behind the scenes image that I had taken with my cell phone ended up selling tons of this particular print because everybody wanted to be able to tell the story and show that to people with a sense of wonder. And so the image itself is valuable, and printing it is paramount to your success. But there's little things that you can do in the process. Printing a small little 4x6 of a behind-the-scenes image to go along with the main print can be a huge asset to you. In the case of this one, very similar setup as well. You might be able to visualize what image this produced, because it's one that I've shown already in the presentation, was this one right here. And so that's kind of a fun little aside. We're putting those behind-the-scenes image. In the case of this one, you've got a flashlight that has a polarizing film on it. And I so do love my big bulky flashlights. It's beaming into this shard of ice that was growing in a bucket. And if I adjust the angle of the camera in just the right way, with a polarizing filter on the flashlight, a polarizing filter on the camera, I can see these wonderful colors start to show up within the ice structure itself. And for people to see how that comes together, that makes them appreciate the end result image that I am showing them as an abstract print. Because now they know exactly how it was produced, and that those colors are created through the technical term is birefringence, but the cross-polarization effect on certain objects can create these beautiful rainbow colors. These colors don't need to be necessarily accurate in my print, but if I have those behind-the-scenes prints alongside, it lets people realize that there is something true about the colors that they are seeing in this particular image. And I think that that is one of the most important lessons to have when you're trying to print these works. A little bit larger than macro scale, but again, specific to green tones and the overall brightness and darkness of the image. It affects most of the work that I do with the exact same idea of, okay, where are those brights going to fall? Where are the darks? What is the warm tone quality of the print overall? And what kind of medium is that going to be best printed on? I've got some blues in the metal. I've got some warmth in the railroad tie. So I could go in many different ways with this image on either a luster type paper, a fine art matte paper possibly even for this one. I don't use it often, but it would work well for a print like this. There's tons of different choices for you, but the image has to suit the choice that you're making. And there's no one paper that I go to and say everything's going to be printed on. You know, for example, this one would be brilliant on that metallic paper that I love so much because of those white tones all over the place, including the snowdrop that was noticeably pushed to white overall in these areas, which would just shimmer and shine in the finished print at the end of the day. You'll also notice that very few of my images are set to standard print formats. This one might fit close to an 8x10 size, but I'll produce them at just about any size imaginable and get custom mats made for those prints. Getting a custom mat cut to fit an odd-sized print in a standard frame size is relatively inexpensive. And if the image is a stronger image for keeping that crop true to the composition, then I think that that's a valuable thing for you to consider as well. Don't keep your images at the 4x6, 5x7, 8, 10, 11, 14, etc. size. Choose the image size that matches the print most appropriately, and that could be whether this is 8.5 by 9.5 as a finished size. I'll choose a matte and get that custom made. There's lots of online places where you can get them done that will handle that for you very nicely and put the final product together if you're doing smaller prints and what have you. And to wind off, just a few little things. One final image and then one final quick demo. This is another very brilliant, vibrant kind of image that I would prefer to have printed on more of a metallic type paper, especially the center area would add a little subliminal shimmer to it overall. But you know, the colors in this image change over larger gradients, and they're not just one solid swath of color like it was in that freezing soap bubble that looked wrong. If the colors in this image print very close to what this is, then I'm happy with it because it's got a magical quality that I don't necessarily need 100% in terms of accuracy, but just expectability. Oh, that's not a word, but I need to expect what those colors are going to be in the finished print. If this turned out where these magentas, these more purple colors were more magenta on the outside, I would be very disappointed with the print. So I might have to sway the colors specifically to get them more into the range where I would like them to be. but it's a range, and it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% perfect for images that have a more abstract nature. But for photos like this, depth of field might fall off very sharply, or I might have an issue with sharpness due to diffraction in some way. So I want to share with you one last tip that I do with most of my macro images before I send them to print. And so that is how I sharpen in Photoshop. So I'll take this other image that we haven't seen yet for something a little bit different. And we'll describe sort of what I do. If I were to zoom in on this, you'll see that the image itself has a fair amount of sharpness, but these areas could really pop a little bit more inside of these droplets. The actual blade of grass itself does fall out of focus through most of it, so it really depends on these areas to pop more than they would before. The sharpening technique that I prefer most for this is using a high-pass filter, though it does have a slight twist to it, the way that I implement it in these particular images. So what I'm going to do is I'm right-click on my image, and I'm going to duplicate the layer so that I've got another copy of it. That if I run through on the filter menu, if I go under Other, we have High-Pass Filter. And what this does is it creates a version of the image that all varies off of a middle gray, where bright areas can get brighter than that, dark areas can get darker, and that will add contrast to the image when I apply a certain blending mode to it. And so I might choose something with an appropriate radius to get that pop. You can overdo it. You can make it just too garish, but sometimes, you know, depending on the resolution of the image, of course, between 1.5 and 2.5 radius is probably where I would normally be sitting myself in this kind of high pass effect. So what I will do then is, with this set up properly, I change my blending mode to overlay. And if I were to zoom in on this, we'll see that there is a lot of extra pop that is added into the darker areas and the brighter areas, giving me that separation and making the image more vibrant to me overall in terms of that just ethereal drama that is hidden inside of these droplets. The challenge, though, is I'm amplifying the noise at the same time. So if I turn that off, you'll see that the noise is there. It's slightly soft, but the noise ends up being amplified as well as the details. So what I'll do is I will bring up the Camera Raw filter. And in Camera Raw filter, it popped up on the wrong screen here. Let me just pull that back over here. In this filter, if I zoom in on it quite a bit, well, geez, you know, quite a bit. There you go. Let's go to 100%, maybe one step farther than that. You'll see that the noise in this image is still there. If I take the noise reduction and I crank this up well past 50%, maybe around 70 or so, then that noise fades, and it does fade the effect of the high-pass filter to some degree, but it's going to survive enough with that effect in order to, you know, diminish the noise, but still get that extra bit of oomph out of the image when it goes to print. And so that's how I'll typically get my sharpening on. And it's going to be subtle. You're going to have to nose up to it to see that difference. But it's going to make that difference. That extra 2 to 5% of just resharpening the image at the end can make the difference between me enjoying a print or me wanting to have it reprinted to get it as good as it can possibly be. So that, I think, winds down my webinar. I think it was a fun chat on printing macro photography. And I'd like to go to any questions that we have at this point as we wrap up. Jim asks, what are the attributes of the metallic satin over the other bright papers? Is the choice dependent on the color within the image? The choice is dependent somewhat on the color when I'm using a bright white luster paper or the metallic satin, but it's more how close things play to white. So in this case, if you have just pure white, it means that there's no ink being laid onto the paper itself. And that means that the underlying shimmer that is part of the paper becomes more prominent in that case. So in this final image that I was showing, I've got a bright white blob of invisible ink that has almost like this little universe of stars forming inside of it. And that would shimmer as somebody walks by that print in a room or in a hallway with the light kind of casting off of it. And so it's how close it is to a pure white point that the metallic paper is more interesting to me. And especially where that is, because there was an image earlier on that had that gazania in the background of that Weevil photograph. And that was bright white in the background too. but it would have been a distracting element to have that shimmering where the subject would not be shimmering in that sense. So yeah, keeping in mind where your bright whites are going to be in the photograph, almost all of my snowflake images are printed on that metallic satin paper because it just, the paper itself comes through where there is very little ink being laid down, and that shimmer is part of that process, and it works really, really well for some of those subjects. Stephen asks, can you share how you set your dark and light values in Photoshop so that you maintain texture throughout the printed image? Sure, Steve. I can. What I'll do is I'll just bring up Photoshop, and let's see if I can open up a random image from my many random images. Bring up a snowflake, and let's just choose one that has a fair enough contrast in it to appear interesting. Something like this one. And we wait. There we go. Okay, so in this case, you can see that the background that I have set was black, and I can choose it to set to a default. I think this one I might have already prepped for printing. If I set this to white, I can see that if I it's harder to see with this particular kind of image, but I've got this as a comparison to the print overall. Sometimes I'll even just zoom out quite a bit and see how this would look surrounded by a white paper. And then I can set the black in Photoshop just by right-clicking on the background and choosing any of these colors. By the way, white is my custom, so I can set custom color. Lightroom has white by default, but Photoshop does not. So you've got to use the custom setting to bring that in and to see exactly where that's going to be. And in that sense, I can choose from here. I can either do a curves adjustment to control the blacks in the background, but more often than not, I'll simply revert like a duplicate version of my layer and use the Camera Raw filter, which in Camera Raw would have my shadows and black sliders, and then if it's a duplicated layer, I can choose exactly where that's going to come in to shadows that I want to be punchy, or others that might deserve to be a solid black in that sense, and I can apply that using an adjustment layer if it's on a separate layer in Photoshop. So that's just a quick example as to how you can set that level by changing the background color in Photoshop overall. So Brett asks, what's my go-to macro lens and what power do you use it? That is a loaded question, Brett, for maybe another webinar, but I will tell you that my daily driver macro lens is the Canon MPE 65mm macro lens. It'll get by default between 1:1 magnification and 5:1. In the case of my snowflake work, it typically starts at 5:1. And if I add extension tubes onto that lens, I can get it up to 6:1. And if I add either a teleconverter, or Canon used to make what they call their life-size converter EF, that'll double that magnification as well. So I can get it all the way up to 12:1 magnification for some of the smaller snowflakes. And when I'm getting to those smaller snowflakes, the smallest of them that I produce, something like, for example, this one here, is produced on a 12:1 magnification scale. And so if I were to really zoom in on this image critically, it might not be as perfectly sharp as I would like it to be because of diffraction, because light is going to start bending off course. So the type of pre-print sharpening that I'm going to be doing for this, like I would do that high-pass filter, now it might be more extensive on this one. I might push past that 2.5 pixel radius into something around 3 or 4 in certain areas where I really want to bring out some contrast and give the image a little bit more punch as a result. So at 12:1 magnification, you can do some really wonderful things, but it's a challenge to get everything sharp because light doesn't behave in my favor when I'm doing that sort of stuff. Sorry, Kathleen says, did you say you put non-standard size prints with mats into standard size frames? And yes, that's exactly what I said, Kathleen. For example, with snowflakes specifically, I'll print them as like a 10x10, and I mat them to 14x14, and I've got a bunch of pre-made 14x14 frames because most of my snowflakes all fit that same size. They're all square, and so I can pre-order frames in bulk when I'm doing it that way, and it reduces my cost on that. So there is an exception to that rule, but if I were to be doing a print of, say, something, it could be even like this image that we were just talking about. This is a non-standard crop. So if I were to say, maybe if I were to print this to be let's say 16 inches wide, if I take my crop tool here and I just cancel out the second value in Photoshop, and I kind of re-expand this. So if I wanted this to be 16 inches wide and I just press the Enter key, it'll automatically calculate on the height. Well, that's about 9.5 almost. So if I were to be putting this into a frame, I would have to accommodate for that sort of sizing. So if I were to make that 20 inches wide, then 20 inches wide is going to be almost what's about 11 3/4 or so in height, and so I would accommodate for that. If this was to be in a 20 by 16 print, well, sort of matte or frame rather. Geez, if I could get my words right, then it would be the 16-inch size for the print, and it would be 16 by 9 matted to 20 by 16. And so there'd be some extra space around it for sure, but the cost of framing something like that would be a lot less, because I can get ready-made frames, especially when they're on sales from some of the craft stores. The quality, yes, is not going to be absolutely 100%. The glass is not going to be museum glass in any way, but it would be to make the print more affordable for a certain market. And so that's how I would be doing some of my sizing, and then getting the mats custom cut for that particular print, or a series of prints at that same size. Kent asks, should I desaturate the high pass layer to not distort or introduce other colors and then overlay? Yeah, well, typically in the case of this particular image, if I were to zoom in critically on this image right here, where I've got that high pass filter in play, if I were to cancel out all color on, why did it not talk to me there? There we are. If I were to, why is Photoshop is deciding to misbehave on me as I want to try and do something. It's now locked out my layer selections as I try to do a black and white conversion. Okay, well, to answer your question, Kent, it might make some small, minuscule difference, but it's not going to be a huge effect on the image. As you saw as I turned it on and off, it might adjust some of the saturation point of some of those colors, but it's doing so in conjunction with brightening and darkening them. If I notice anything that is untoward in those particular images, then for me, yes, that is something that I would go in and adjust. Oh, there it is. It popped way under everything else. There's my black and white adjustment. So there's my before and after making the black and white as just a blanket black and white adjustment. I find it to be more punchier when it is without the black and white conversion of it, ever so slightly, but the colors don't shift to any great extent in any images that I've applied that technique with. Bruce says, not a question, this was a wonderful, this was wonderful, thank you very much, Bruce. Love the out-of-gamut printing tutorial in Lightroom. You know, a lot of people don't know, especially when you hit those saturated colors, what the printer's going to do. And even in an image like this, it might tell me that some of these really bright, dark oranges in here would not print properly. If they sway too far to red as a result, then it's going to look weird. And I'd rather them sway a little bit more towards the yellows in the flower than towards reds. So making sure that you can control where those colors fall, I think, is a very valuable tip that we should all remember. And thank you, Stella, for saying that my work is stunning. And what is my favorite subject to shoot? You know, snowflakes I've done so many times, it's hard to say that they're a favorite. They are by far the most prolific. But water droplet refraction imagery overall, I think, has so much room for experimentation. And I've got so many ideas that I still need to explore with this kind of photograph. I've done it so many times with just the simple setup that you see here, blade of grass, water droplet, and flower in the background. I've recently, last year, started adding in live actors like that ant. Man, if I could get like ants fighting each other on a blade of grass with water droplets around, wouldn't that be fun? So technically challenging in every possible way, but the more challenging it is, I think the more interesting it becomes. I've been recently exploring another kind of subject. I don't know if I put it in my flowers folder or my ultraviolet folder. It's in ultraviolet. This is some crocuses that are specifically photographed in ultraviolet only light, and they're a purple flower in the visible spectrum, very close to the end of the spectrum, hitting into ultraviolet, but they reflect nothing in UV. And so this year there will be some grand experiments exploring what happens with flowers in ultraviolet, the patterns that insects can see within them, and why certain flowers will be very, very dark versus very, very bright. daisies and tulips, for example, are incredibly dark. But daisies are white flowers. White crocuses are dark in ultraviolet. And so for me, to further your question, Stella, this is a favorite subject to shoot because I know very little about it, and I've just started exploring it. And the unpredictability of that exploration ends up being something that drives my passion in the work that I create. And final question, Robert asks, do you test your prints with museum glass to see the effect caused by OBAs? That's nothing that I've done yet, but Robert, the idea, and I've had this for a while, and I'm daring myself this year to actually go ahead and do it, is to take museum glass and non-museum glass and paper of all variety and do little tests, like very, very small test prints, and put a bunch of that behind museum glass, put a bunch of it behind regular glass, and maybe do a control that I stick in a closet somewhere that has no light on it, and just see what the difference is from everything from the highest end OBA-free cotton-based archival paper to newsprint, and see what happens to the result of the images under different glass. And to me, even if somebody else has done that research, that's fine and I can read it, but I need to do it myself in order to appreciate how it affects exactly the materials that I'm using on an everyday basis, including the ink and paper, which are all affected by ultraviolet light. So there we go. I think that was fun. We went on for about an hour, including the questions. If you have any further questions for me, I'm sure that you can get my contact information from X-Rite, or at the end of this webinar, we can send out a little note to all of you so that if you have follow-up questions that you can get in touch, and I'm always happy to continue this discussion. I'm passionate about it, as you can probably tell, and making a great print is very important to that final presentation. I'm a firm believer that the image isn't finished until you print it, especially because when you print it, you'll notice that little blade of grass that's sticking out where it shouldn't, or a dust spot that you meant to get rid of, and now you'll never unsee it until you print it again. But it helps you make the perfect image at the end of the day, and that's what this was all about. Thanks, everybody.